All right. So upon starting this class, I thought that a Chicano was an individual who was born and raised in the US or were brought into the US at an early age and were specifically from Mexican descent. The article "What is a Chicano" by Chich Marin asserts that the term Chicano was originally a term created by Mexicans for those Mexicans who were living in the US. And it revolved around this idea that these Mexicans were no longer truly Mexicans because they had given up their whole country, whether they chose to or not. And in most cases, while they didn't really choose to, they were looking for a better life. I want to start off by establishing that I myself consider myself Chicano because both of my parents are Mexican immigrants and I was born and raised here in Santa Ana and have lived here all my life. However, I was unaware of how contradicting the term can be and with regards to one's identity. After watching the module videos, listening to the podcast, and engaging with the articles, my perspective on the term Chicano completely changed. Now I believe a Chicano is more than just a human being. I now define it as a state of mind, as a culture, but more importantly, an identity and a revolution because of how hard people had to fight in order to gain respect for this term. For instance, the podcast addressed the Peruvian Salvadorian Berta Avila, who identifies as a Chicana herself, even though she is not of Mexican descent. This is where my interpretation of a Chicano as an identity kind of changed because I realized that the term does not just emphasize ethnicity or where your parents are from, yet instead it encompasses the discrimination that Latino first generation children faced growing up in the US. I believe a Chicano is an individual of Latin American descent who grew up in the United States and has worked alongside the Mexican community to fight for their culture and for the liberation of the Latino communities. This is because Chicano is identifying as a way of life. And in my opinion, it should emphasize the struggles and the hardships, meaning that we cannot leave out all these other Latinos who fought with the Mexicans. On the other hand, I must acknowledge that the term Chicano can be a bit contradictory or maybe not the best due to its exclusion of other Latinos and the queer community members. For instance, the podcast addresses the student movement of Mecha, and it was undergoing name changes due to its exclusion. Specifically, it was trying to remove the term Chicano and Aztlan from its name. However, I believe that you have to declare yourself Chicano in order to be Chicano, because my idea of this term, as previously mentioned, has nothing to do with what country your parents came from or where they immigrated from, but rather the struggle that Latinos share in common with growing up in the US. I, for one, can confirm that language barriers were probably the most difficult for me, considering that I was the oldest sibling and that my parents knew very, very, very little English. And given this information, I grew up being their translator, whether it be at the doctor's office or at the grocery store. I became a translator at a young age. This not just goes for verbal translation, but also documents. Uh, and sometimes for other people too that, I didn't know, I stepped up for my community. Uh, However, an example that I want to bring up is an encounter I had at middle school with one of my classmates in science class. So we were a bit shy at first, nothing wrong with that. We didn't know each other. But as time went on, we began to open up to each other. And it turns out we shared similar struggles. Neither of our parents were born in the US. We were both born in the US, and we both grew up in the US. However, she was 100% Salvadorian descent. Her parents are from El Salvador, and we both shared these language barriers, this struggle of having to step up and translate for our parents. And this is kind of what I want to bring up here to prove that this is exactly why I chose to believe that the term Chicano is a state of mind and revolves around the philosophy of struggle and not necessarily ethnic descent, because we were both, I was fully Mexican, she was fully Salvadorian, yet we kind of shared this similar struggle of growing up um, with immigrant parents in the US. Overall, just as stated in the video, in one of the videos, Chicanismo means to believe an ideal for all of us to live together as one, which is la raza cósmica. I love this concept of community that encompasses the term Chicano because I believe it's important to not forget where we came from, but also not forget who gave us these privileges that we have today through the Chicano civil rights movement in the 60s. I'm glad that my perspective of the term Chicano has already changed with just one module, and I'm excited to see how the rest of the course will change my viewpoints on these concepts for the better.